All right, welcome back to our Chapter 4 discussion. So we're going to start our discussion of equivalent units, and then I have picked out a problem to do out of the practice exam that puts that template to good use that I've posted within the Chapter 4 module that we'll be using essentially for the entirety of Chapter 4. It kind of puts everything in a nice and organized space. Okay, so we said we want to start off our discussion with focus on equivalent units of production. So with the equivalent units of production, that's something specific to process costing here. So usually a department, again, because remember these departments are working on homogeneous items, right, and doing a lot on a continual basis. So usually a department is going to have incomplete or partially complete units in beginning and ending work in process inventories. So this kind of complicates determining how much of an output each department has for a period and what each unit cost is if there are incomplete units sitting in beginning and ending inventories. So we have to calculate equivalent units of production to help us out with that issue. So equivalent units of production, that refers to the number of completed units that could be, and the emphasis there is on could be, number of completed units that could be produced with the resources, really costs, with the resources that have already been applied to the incomplete units. So basically the equivalent units of production looks at how many complete units could I have made looking at what I've spent so far on these incomplete and complete units that I have so far. Okay, so if I've spent $100 to get 3 units partially complete, what does that really equate to in terms of complete units? If I spent $100, how many units could I have completed with that same amount of cost being spent? So you calculate your equivalent units by taking the number of incomplete units and you multiply that by the percentage completion of those units. Really, that doesn't have to say incomplete units, that can also just say number of units, because we will also be looking at not just equivalent units in ending work in process, but also just units that actually were completed. So to kind of simplify that, just say number of units that we're looking at times what percentage they are complete. So to put this into perspective, what if I have 2 units that are 50% complete with respect to production? Well, the equivalent units in that case, what's the number of units? It's 2 units. We multiply that by their percentage completion, which is 50%. That is equivalent to 1 unit that is 100% complete. So what that's saying is whatever we spent on getting these 2 units half done, we could have spent that same amount to get 1 unit completely done. So that's what that's telling us there. Okay, so if I have, let's say for the period, we completed 10 units with 5 units left. And actually, let's make that a little bit easier number there with, let's say with 10 units left that are 50% complete. How would we find the total equivalent units of production? Well, we can apply that same calculation to the 10 units that are complete. If the 10 units are complete, what's their percentage completion if they're complete? 100%. 10 units that are 100% complete, the equivalent units in that situation is still 10 units. And this would be the units that are transferred out of the department because they're complete. Now, the 5 units that are left over in ending inventory, they are 50% complete. Or not, it wasn't 5 units, sorry, that was 10 units. The 10 units left over in ending inventory were 50% complete. 10 times 50% gives me 5 units. So that would be the equivalent units of production sitting in ending inventory. So overall, the equivalent units of production here comes out to 15 units. So whatever money I spent so far to get not only these 10 units 100% complete, but these 10 units 50% complete, we could have taken all that money and completed 15 units 100%. Okay, so that's what that equivalent units is looking at. Now, there are 2 ways that we can calculate equivalent units and end up finding the unit cost of each item that has been produced. There's 2 ways. We have the first in, first out method, and then we have the weighted average method. The FIFO method, that is addressed in the appendix to the chapter. Our main focus will be on the weighted average method. Since this one is the more simplified method and easier to put into practice, but both of them have the same approach, there are just some differences there. With the weighted average method, there's no distinction between work done in prior and current periods. So costs are blended from past periods with current periods. Okay, that's not the case with first in, first out. In that case, we're actually making that distinction. Okay, and we determine equivalent units of a department with the weighted average method by adding the number of units completed and transferred out to the equivalent units in ending work in process. So just like we did just there. So the equivalent units here are calculated by taking the number of units, equivalent units of a department, number of units completed and transferred out of the department, meaning they're done. So number of units completed and transferred out, those are 100% complete, by the way. And to that, we add the equivalent units in ending work in process inventory. So that's exactly what we did above, and that's how we do it with the weighted average method. Now the costs per equivalent unit, and we'll see this in the template all taken together, but the costs per equivalent unit is defined as the total costs for the period divided by the equivalent units of production. So one important point to make here, one assumption or the way that this template is designed is that direct labor oftentimes tends to be small in comparison to your direct materials and your overhead. So for this reason, direct labor is being lumped into manufacturing overhead. And as if you recall, when you add direct labor to manufacturing overhead, that gives us conversion costs. So when we work with that template in a moment, you'll see conversion cost, which refers to overhead and direct labor all taken together, as opposed to having 3 separate categories there, just because of the size of direct labor normally in proportion to the other 3. And just lastly, a relationship here that will definitely be useful to kind of understand what's happening there in that template. When you take beginning inventory and you add the units transferred in from the other department, so this is if you're Department B, for example, whatever you start with in Department B, if you add the units that came from Department A, that should be equal to the units that you completed in Department B, plus whatever you're left with in ending inventory. So any beginning inventory within a department, plus the units that were added into that department, moved over to that department, should be equal to the units that are transferred out. So units completed would be transferred out of the department. So it should be equal to the units transferred out plus that ending inventory. Okay, so we're going to switch over here in a second to the last problem in that practice exam using that template. All right, here's that weighted average method template that I was talking about. This is a really nice template because regardless of how long the problem is that you're having to complete for this process costing chapter, this template will be able to get you an answer. So this is broken up into 4 steps. So the first step is just calculating out the physical units that we need to account for. The second step here on this right-hand side area, it's the calculation of equivalent units for a specific department. Then step 3 is this middle section where we actually calculate the cost per equivalent unit of work done in a current period for a specific department. And then lastly, our step 4 is a cost reconciliation, making sure it all adds up and equals out. So with some of our questions, whether it's the homework or the practice exam, it might simply ask us what is the equivalent units with respect to conversion costs. In that case, you would only use that first section. But the next problem might ask you, okay, what's the conversion cost per equivalent unit for that department? Then you'd work down all the way until you get to this box here. Or some problems might even ask you what the total cost is of the units that were transferred out to the next department, and even what the total cost is of the work in process units, ending work in process units. In that case, we'd actually have to work down a little bit further to get to that answer. But everything follows through to the next one. So you can't figure out, for example, this box here, the total cost and ending work in process, if you haven't done the work prior to that. So the best way to understand what's going on with this template is to actually do a problem. So what we'll do here is I'll kind of switch back and forth between the practice exam here and the problem. We'll kind of do our best here. All right, so the problem I'm looking at is problems 10 through 11. But I'm not even going to look at 10 and 11, the questions yet. I'm just going to show you guys how to fill out the template using this information, then we can see what they're asking us for. So here we have Fuller Corporation. They use the weighted average method in its process costing system. This month, the beginning inventory in the first processing department consists of 600 units. The costs and percentage completion of these units in beginning inventory were. So the beginning inventory, the units in beginning inventory, so far Fuller Corporation had spent $12,200 in material costs on those 600 units in beginning inventory and $10,400 in terms of conversion costs, which is a mixture of direct labor and overhead. But those units weren't complete if they're still sitting in beginning inventory, they're not done. So it shows that they are incomplete there. And then further it says a total of 9,500 units were started and 8,000 units were transferred to the second processing department during the month. So we started work on 9,500 extra units in the month, but for that month as well, we completed 8,000 units that we went and shifted and moved to the second processing department for that department to complete and start its work. So it says the following costs were incurred in the first processing department during the month. So during this month, while we started and finished units, we spent an additional $160,700 on materials and an additional $412,400 on conversion costs. It says the ending inventory was 80% complete with respect to materials and 62% complete with respect to conversion costs. So that's a lot of information, but as we do this more and more, you'll see that there's really a pattern to this, and this is the longest kind of problem that you'll see where we'll actually be able to fill out this entire template. So if you look at this template, the very first box here is labeled work in process beginning, but you see that first column here is labeled physical units. So how many physical units were in the beginning work in process? Well, they said that the beginning work in process, the physical amount of units was 600, if I actually count that. So we'll go ahead and add 600 there. And how many physical units did we start during the month? They gave that to us as well. We started work on 9,500 units. We started work on additional 9,500 units for the month. So we'll go ahead and put 9,500 in there. So remember, from that relationship that I mentioned just a couple moments ago, we go back to our whiteboard, that beginning inventory plus units transferred in should be equal to the units completed plus the ending inventory. So just keep in mind we're already starting to work on the left-hand side of that relationship here with that template. So if I had 600 physical units in this department to begin with, and I started work on 9,500 additional ones, how many units do we then need to account for? It's simply going to be the addition of those two amounts there. 600 plus 9,500 gives us 10,000. Gives us 10,100. Okay, so that's the total units that I need to account for. All right. Next, it asks us units transferred to the next department. How many physical units did we transfer to the next department? How many were completed and transferred? They said 8,000 units were transferred to the second processing department, meaning we finished that amount. So we'll go ahead and add 8,000 in here. Well, if you transfer these units to the next department, did this current department complete its work? It must have, right? The only way you can transfer units to the next department is if you've completed them 100% with respect to the activities that need to be done in that department. So if we now move over to this step 2 here, remember equivalent units, that's the number of units times their percentage completion. Well, if these 8,000 units are done, they are 100% complete with respect to both materials and conversion costs. So with this template, as soon as you fill in this transferred to next department box, in this case 8,000, you simply copy it over to those next two boxes. And why do we just copy it over? Because if the 8,000 units are complete, that means they're 100% done. So the equivalent, the physical units of 8,000 that are complete, it's the same. The equivalent units is also 8,000 because equivalent units is units times percent completion. All right. So next we want to find that next box right here is work in process ending. So if we look there, they didn't quite give us the work in process, the ending work in process physical units, but that's okay. We can figure it out. Because if we started with 600 units and we added in 9,500, but now we finished 8,000 of it, we can find how much must be left. Remember that 600 and then 9,500, that gives us 10,100. So that's how many units we needed to account for. Of that 10,100 units, we finished 8,000 of them. So to find the ending work in process, we'd simply take the total units to account for and subtract out how much we completed and transferred away. So 10,100 minus 8,000 should give me 2,100 there. As soon as you finish this 2,100, because we're still there in the physical units column for that 2,100, you're going to go over and immediately copy it over to these two boxes to the left. This is going to facilitate the calculation of our equivalent units of production, specifically for ending work in process. Let me see if I can move that over. That's okay. All right. So the 2,100 units in ending work in process, they're not done. So although there's 2,100 physical units, they're not 100% complete. So they actually tell us how complete those ending units were with respect to materials and conversion costs. You want to ignore the percentage completion of the beginning inventory. We are ignoring that with the weighted average method. We're only concerned with the percentage completion of ending inventory. And they gave that to us. They said the ending inventory was 80% complete with respect to materials and 62% complete with respect to conversion costs. So what that means is those units still sitting in ending inventory, they still need about 20% of materials cost added to them to get them done, and just under 40% of conversion costs added to them to get them done. So that's really what that says there. So you take those two percentages, 80% complete with respect to materials and 62% complete with respect to conversion costs, and we plug those percentages in here to these boxes. So it said that those 2,100 units were 80% complete with respect to materials. Again, see that arrow follows under that direct materials column. And those units were 62% complete with respect to conversion costs. So remember, we said to calculate equivalent units of production, you take the units and you multiply it by its percentage completion. That's what these boxes on the left are just facilitating for us. We're trying to fill out the step 2 here, labeled equivalent units. We want to fill in this blank box and this blank box, but these boxes on the left are just showing us or detailing the work that we need to do. So 2,100 times 80%, that means the ending work in process equivalent units with respect to direct materials comes out to 1,680. So in other words, the money I spent so far on those 2,100 units, the materials cost I spent on those 2,100 units so far to get them 80% complete, I could have spent that same amount of money in terms of direct materials to get 1,680 units complete with respect to their direct materials cost. And we're going to do the same with conversion costs. Those 2,100 units in ending work in process were 62% complete with respect to conversion costs. 2,100 times 62%, that should give us 1,302 equivalent units of production in ending inventory. All right, now for our last row. So again, the step 1 here is separate from step 2 in that step 1, the units that we're working with is physical units, where with step 2, we're working with equivalent units. So those two we need to make sure we're keeping those separate. All right, let's finish up step 1. So we said the beginning work in process plus the units we added in give us 10,100. That's how many units we need to account for. But then of those 10,100 units, we finished 8,000 of them, leaving us with 2,100 units. How many units do we still need to account for? If you take the units that you transferred and completed, plus your ending physical units, if you take 8,000 plus 2,100, you should come out to 10,100 as well. And that equals the total units to account for up here. That tells us we've done it correctly. So if that 10,100 up here equals the 10,100 down here, then we've done something right. Okay? So those two need to match up, and that goes back to that relationship we said, where beginning inventory plus inventory added should be equal to how much that leaves inventory and how much is left over. So these two amounts need to be equal to these two amounts when they're added together. So now let's complete step 2. So we're looking at equivalent units with respect to direct materials and with respect to conversion costs. So with direct materials, 8,000 of the units were transferred and completed, so they're 100% complete with respect to materials. But when looking at ending work in process, Of the 2,100, they were only 80% complete with respect to materials, so that really, in terms of equivalent units, that came out to 1,680. So what's my total equivalent units with respect to direct materials? We simply add these two together. So 8,000 plus 1,680, that gives us 9,680. We're going to do the same for conversion costs. 8,000 of the units were transferred out and completed, meaning they're 100% complete with respect to conversion costs. But the ending work in process, those 2,100 units were only 62% complete with respect to conversion costs. So in terms of equivalent units, that really only comes out to 1,302 equivalent units. So my total equivalent units of production with respect to conversion costs comes out to 9,302 equivalent units. All right. Very good. So now we're going to go on to step 3, finding the costs per equivalent units of production. So the nice thing with this is once we get comfortable with this template, the majority of the information is given to us. We just need to organize it properly so we can do some of those calculations. So we can see here that the first line, when we're trying to calculate costs to be accounted for, is the work in process, the beginning work in process costs. So let's see what they gave us. In terms of beginning inventory, we see here that says the cost and percentage completion of the units in beginning inventory were as follows. So far we had spent 12,200 and 10,400 respectively on materials and conversion costs. So we're just going to plug that in to that template. So the beginning inventory materials cost so far was 12,200. So in the template, that's where I'll plug in that 12,200. And the conversion cost was, what was that? 10,400. So if the direct materials cost in beginning inventory, beginning work in process inventory was 12,200 and conversion cost was 10,400, we can find the total cost in beginning inventory. We simply add those two together across horizontally. So when you add 12,200 and 10,400, you should get 22,600. All right, next line is costs added in. So the extra money spent on materials and conversion costs within this department. So let's see what they say there. It says the following costs were incurred in the first processing department during the month. So an additional materials cost and conversion costs of 160,700 and 412,400. So we're just going to plug those in as well. So this month we spent an additional 160,700 on materials to do the work in the department and spent an additional 412,400 on conversion costs to get the work completed for the period. So if I added in this much of direct materials cost and this much of conversion costs, how much cost did I add in overall? Again, we just add those two together and add horizontally. When you add those two amounts together, you should get $573,100. All right, so if I started with $22,600 in beginning work in process, and then I added in another $573,100, what's my total cost to account for then? Simply just those two added together. So when you add the beginning work in process cost plus the cost we added in, that comes out to $595,700. Now a tip here, as you progress through this template, if we're having to do the entire one, just a little heads up. This box right here needs to agree at the end of the day with the box, that last box down there. So if you've done the work correctly to follow, that box should be the same as the number down below. So let's see how we do. We'll get there in a second. All right, and see this total cost to account for, we added vertically for total costs, but we can do that as well for direct materials and conversion cost. We started with 12,200 of direct materials cost in beginning work in process, but then we added in another 160,700. So the total direct materials cost to account for is just those two added together. When you add them together, you get $172,100. $900. We'll do the same with conversion costs. We started with $10,400 of conversion costs in beginning inventory for work in process. Then we spent even more. We spent $412,400 on more conversion costs during the period within this department with relation specifically to conversion costs. So when you add those two together, you should get $422,800 there. All right, so we found the total cost to account for overall, but also specifically if we break it down to in direct materials and conversion cost categories. So that's the total cost to account for. Now we want to divide each of these total direct materials costs and total conversion costs by the equivalent units of work done in the current period. Now that we already found. We found the equivalent units of production, equivalent units of work done in the current period. That is this number, and that is this number over here. So those are the total equivalent units of work done specifically for direct materials and then for conversion costs. So we're just going to, you copy these two numbers over to these boxes down here. So the 9680 gets copied down right down here. So that's my equivalent units of work done with respect to direct materials, and the equivalent units of work done with respect to conversion costs is the 9,302. So if the total direct materials cost to account for so far in this department is 172,900, we're saying that that's how much was spent in terms of additional costs and the cost we started with to get to 9,680 equivalent units of production. So in other words, that's how much we spent in terms of direct materials to get 8,000 units completely done and some of the work in process partially done. So the 2,100 units, remember, really, if you look at the 80% completion, really is equivalent to 1,680 complete units. So that's how much direct materials money we spent and could have spent to get 9,680 units complete, as opposed to 8,000 units complete and 2,100 somewhat complete. So the cost per equivalent unit, we're just simply going to divide that direct materials cost in total divided by the equivalent units of work done. So when you divide the 172,900 by the 9680, you should get $17.86. You want to really round this to like the 4th decimal place for rounding error purposes on the practice exam. But for the most part, you can infer what the right answer is there just by looking at the options. And we're going to do the same for conversion costs. We're going to take that total conversion cost to account for and divide it by the total equivalent units of work done. And when you divide that 422,800 by the 9,302, rounded, that comes out to $45.45 of conversion cost per equivalent unit of work done. All right, so that is step 3. And finally, step 4 is where we're doing a cost reconciliation, where we're going to find the cost associated with those units transferred to the next department and the cost associated with the total work in process. All right, so we want to know what the direct materials cost is related to units transferred and conversion cost. So how many units were transferred out? We know that is 8,000, so you can put 8,000 into both of these boxes here because that's how many units we were transferred out. But now we don't want to just know how many units were transferred out. We want to know what the cost is for those units, specifically with relation to direct materials and conversion costs. So the direct materials cost per equivalent unit, we just found that, right? That's the 1786. So we're going to copy over that 1786 down there. And the conversion cost per equivalent unit, that's the 4545. So these 8,000 units that were completed, each of them cost us about 1786 in terms of direct materials. So when you take 8,000 times 1786, that comes out to $142,880. And those same 8,000 units cost us about $45.45 per unit in terms of conversion costs. So in total, those 8,000 units cost us about $363,600 to complete with respect to conversion costs. So that means with what we spent on direct materials and conversion costs on these 8,000 complete units, if we add those two together, that means not only did we spend $506,488 to get those 8,000 units complete and transferred out, that's how much cost is now going to be transferred from this department to the next, since those units are done. Now we're going to do the same thing, but for work in process ending. With respect to direct materials, what was the equivalent units of production in terms of just ending inventory? Because we're looking at the ending. The ending inventory with respect to direct materials, the equivalent units in ending inventory is 1,680. And the equivalent units of production with respect to conversion costs in ending inventory is 1,302 equivalent units in ending inventory. So each of those equivalent units of production still have the same direct materials and conversion cost per unit attached to them, because we want to know what the cost should be that we assign to ending inventory as well. So remember, the direct materials cost per equivalent unit is $17.86. The conversion cost per equivalent unit is $45.45. So we want to know how much cost to assign, how much direct materials cost to assign to our ending inventory. Well, ending inventory had 1,680 equivalent units with respect to just direct materials. So if you take that 1,680, multiply by 1,786, you should get $30,004.80. And when you multiply the 1,302 equivalent units in ending inventory with respect to conversion costs by 45.45, you should get $59,175.90. So if I should assign over $30,000 in direct materials and just under $60,000 in conversion costs to ending work in process, that means the total cost in ending work in process should just be the total of those two. We add those two together, you should get something along the lines of $89,180.7. 180.7. All right, lastly, we need to know what total cost to account for. So the cost transfer to the next department, we're going to add that to whatever is in the cost in ending inventory. So to get to the total cost to account for down here, you're just going to take the cost transferred to the next department plus what the costs that are left. So when you take that 506,480 and you add the 89,180, you should get 595,660.7. And because there's rounding error, we're slightly off, but this box right here is equal to this box down here. We're about $40 off because of rounding error. But those two boxes agree. So we've just done all of that work to fill out this template and answer some questions. So let's see what the questions are that the 10 and 11 are asking. So number 10 is asking us, the total cost transferred from the first processing department to the next during the month is closest to. So what's the cost transferred out of this department? That's what we just found down here. Total cost transferred to next department is this 506,480. And the closest one there looks like it is going to be C. And again, there's rounding errors. So here, the cost transferred 506,480. That's close enough to the 506,513. So the answer there would be C, based on the work we did in the template. And then lastly, it says, what's the cost of ending work in process inventory in the first processing department? Cost of ending work in process. Well, that's what we did down here, right? The total work in process ending cost is just over $89,000. And the closest answer here is A. And the answer for that one should be A for number 11. So you'll see with some of the other problems, though, they'll ask you, what was the total cost, what was the direct materials cost per equivalent unit? Then you would have said 1786. So depending on what the problem is asking, you'll pull whatever from the template to answer that question. But some of these problems you won't complete the entire template necessarily. But I did this harder problem to complete the entire template so you can see kind of how that is done. We'll do more as a class, but hopefully that gives you a good foundation. And make sure to print out these templates so that you can do your work in those actual templates as opposed to trying to do all of that just on paper. All right, so that is that for the chapter 4, not including the appendix. So good luck with chapter 4, and we will talk soon.